For young players 16, 17, 18, I don't think you can put yourself into a better environment than major junior hockey, the Western Hockey League, because you're playing against all the top players. Your teammates are the top players. So your runway to the NHL is shorter, but I think you have less time. Where if you play a couple of years of junior A and then go to college hockey, the runway is a little longer. So probably works a little better maybe for late developers. But again, I really believe players that are 16, 17, and 18, they're just in a great spot to grow and develop because they're playing against their best players at their peer group.
That was Garry Davidson, the Player Development Director for the Calgary Hitmen of the WHL, and you are listening to the Up My Hockey podcast with Jason Podolin. Just watch me now. Welcome to Up My Hockey with Jason Podolin, where we deconstruct the NHL journey, discuss what it takes to make it, and have a few laughs along the way. I'm your host, Jason Podolin, a 31st overall draft pick who played 41 NHL games, but thought he was destined for 1,000. Learn from my story and those of my guests. This is a hockey podcast about reaching your potential. Hey there, and welcome back to the Up My Hockey podcast for episode 88. Man, I cannot believe we are closing in on the century mark. This has been a crazy ride, but today we are having a bit of a nostalgic guest for me personally in the name of Garry Davidson. Garry was very instrumental in my career in getting me to junior A level hockey as a 15-year-old. He was the head coach of the Penticton Panthers at the time, and he recruited me from down the lake in Vernon and accepted me with open arms and wanted me to become part of his team. And so Garry was my first real coach, let's say. A real, I say in italics, because obviously I had coaches before, but they were always parent coaches, as most kids have. So moving into junior level hockey, this was the first coach I had that wasn't a parent, that was there strictly for the team and for the benefit of the organization. And Garry had a great impact on me. And through the years and over the years, Garry has been involved in hockey in some capacity or the other over here in Western Canada in either the BCHL as a head coach, GM, or owner, and in the WHL as a head coach, GM, or Director of Player Development, which is where he is now with the Calgary Hitmen. So we're talking about over, what is that? 90s, early 90s, 2000, 2010, like 20, almost 30 years of experience, and in all levels, right? Dealing with junior athletes, dealing with young athletes, whether he's looking to draft them, whether he's coaching them, or whether he's being from an organizational standpoint in the GM role and managing the team. So it's a fantastic conversation. Garry, I believe, is born in 51, so what does that make him? I'm aging you here, Garry, but in his 70s, and he has definitely a fatherly, grandfatherly presence. He has a really calming energy. He's very thoughtful in his approach, as you'll see in his answers, and really authentic with what he has to say. So I really enjoyed this conversation. We talked a lot about bantam hockey. We talked a lot about junior hockey. We talked a lot about the draft and just the governance of hockey in general and where the game is going and what the game looks like now. So if you're a parent or a player who aspires to be drafted, wants to play in the WHL, or is considering different options, whether it be junior A or major junior, this could be a great episode for you. And anytime I have the opportunity to chat with somebody who's been around the game as long as Garry has been, I just completely look forward to it. I love being able to ask questions and have these conversations and to also share them with you. So without further ado, I give you former owner and GM and head coach of the Salmon Arm Silverbacks, head coach of the Penticton Panthers, GM of the Everett Silvertips, Director of Player Personnel for the Portland Winterhawks, and now currently residing as the Director of Player Personnel for the Calgary Hitmen, Mr. Garry Davidson. All right, here we are, Up My Hockey Podcast. I think we're at episode 88 now, and I have my first ever junior coach who went on to many other things after that. But Garry Davidson is here today spending some time with us. So thanks so much for joining us, Garry.
No problem, Jason. Looking forward to visiting with you.
Yeah, for sure. This was in the cards. I told you that last time when we spoke. You're GM of Everett at the time, and I was doing some work with the Silverbacks. And Brooks Christensen, your name came up with Brooks, who I know you know, and I said, "Oh my goodness, I'd love to get in touch with Garry." And so he gave me your email, and then we were set to talk. And then, as the hockey world works, you were no longer in that position anymore, and I didn't know how to contact you again. So, long time coming, but here we are, and I'm glad we're able to do this.
No, that's great. And again, in this business, things change pretty quickly from year to year. So, but Brooks is an interesting one because he was our original stick boy with the Salmon Arm Silverbacks when we first started the team, and a little over 20 years ago. So.
I know, isn't that wild? I love stories like that. I actually had Brooks on in an informal interview for this, and I love his story and what he's doing now. And he's totally stepped into the role and does a great job at it. And yeah, I mean, who knows what the future holds for Brooks? But I from humble beginnings, I guess some could say, and that's those are the stories I like to tell.
Yeah, and he is an up and comer. I mean, he played the game a little bit. Unfortunately, wasn't a great skater at the time, but had great hands and a pretty good head. But I think he's going to do real well in the industry as he moves forward here.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We were joking earlier off camera that we're both suitcases when it comes to the hockey world. But I mean, it's kind of hard not to be honest. But you spend a lot of time in the BCHL and a lot of time in the Western League. And I know I have majority of my platform is from the West, although it is growing. There's many people from the East, but I think it'd be one of the things I'd like to talk about today is your involvement in both leagues. I know that's a definite decision that players make at young ages and are still forced to make at very young ages. I was one of those players myself at one point. I'd love to hear, from your background, kind of what your experience tells you about the two leagues and as far as player development is concerned.
Well, I think they're both very exceptional leagues. Obviously, they're a little bit at different levels. But again, I think the BC Hockey League, which I was started in 1990, the year before I coached you, was my start. And I spent a long time in the league, going from GM coach to eventually an owner GM and coach here in Salmon Arm, where I still reside. But again, it's a terrific league for young players to grow their game and aspire to the next levels. So it's kind of interesting how I ended up in the Western League, though. We sold the Salmon Arm franchise with the idea of establishing a franchise in Wenatchee, Washington. You couldn't own two franchises, so I had to we had to get rid of the Silverbacks here to make that happen, and we had a deal all set to go to Wenatchee. We had the lease in place. We had the purchase of the Williams Lake franchise and relocate them with some conditions, and one of the conditions was USA Hockey would endorse it, which didn't happen, and therefore that whole deal went south. So I basically was sitting in limbo, and someone suggested that I call Mike Johnson in Portland. Mike and I go way back. So I phoned him and he said, yeah, there's going to be an ownership change. I'm going to be GM and coach, and we have nobody on staff that has any junior experience. So one thing led to another, and I was hired there as a director of player personnel, and I've been in the Western League ever since. And it's a terrific league. It's a much younger league than most of the other junior leagues because of the fact you're only allowed 3 overages. There's several 16-year-olds playing in the league. Back in your day, 15-year-olds actually could play junior hockey, but Hockey Canada changed that rule many years ago. So 15-year-olds have to continue to play in the youth programs. But again, this league is a terrific league. It's very professional. It's like every league. Some operations I think are really well run. Some are so, but we also have a whole different gambit of ownerships, which is really unique. We have at least 3 teams owned by NHL teams. We have community-run teams, and then we have private ownership. And in some cases, the private ownership, that's their principal business, such as the gentleman there in Kelowna. So that's kind of a neat dimension that you work through all the different ownerships. And, to think that a Swift Current with 18,000 people can compete in the Western League is pretty incredible, but it's because they're community owned and driven, and they make it work.
Yeah.
So,
you mentioned the NHL ownership, and I noticed from your business card and your email handle that it's actually CalgaryFlames.com. So I assumed that, but I was going to ask you about that. The Calgary Flames then do own the Calgary Hitmen in your scenario?
Yes, in our case, the Calgary Sports and Entertainment Corp owns the Stampeders, the Flames, the Hitmen, the Roughnecks lacrosse team, and again, now they've moved their American League team out of Stockton, and they're in Calgary, so they're running 3 teams out of one building, which has been a bit of a task, but I think they figured it out, and we actually thought we might lose more home games in the Saddle Dome, but we're going to play. I think we've got basically 28 out of our 34 home games are right still in the Saddle Dome. But the other operations are the Edmonton franchise is owned by the Oilers, and Kamloops is owned by the Dallas Stars ownership. So it's those are the three that are tied directly to NHL operations.
Interesting. How does that? Is there the advantages for the AHL team? I can speak to personally, just from being an AHL guy and an NHL guy. I'm sure from a ownership, scouting, availability standpoint, it helps both the players and the and the organization. Right, the proximity is nice. How does it trickle down to the junior level? Is there some collaboration or with the whether it be the big club or the AHL team?
I think the biggest thing is we play in an NHL facility. The NHL team's there. Now the American League team will play their games there, but they're actually their practices are over at Wynn Sport. So that's how they've been able to juggle the 3 teams in the one building. So that's the biggest thing. But again, we function by ourselves, so to speak. Obviously, there are some other things, you might rub shoulders with other scouts and their hockey operations staff. But I'm not in Calgary day in and day out, so I don't have a total appreciation of that. But again, we do our own thing. I mean, we're dealing with a draft of 14-year-olds up to over age 20s, and obviously we have players on our team that have been drafted, but not necessarily drafted by our ownership group. Yeah, the biggest perk for me is the fact that we're in an NHL building with weight rooms and access. I guess one of the other things is probably access a little on the injury prevention, the injury looking after injuries and all those sorts of things, because we work hand in hand with them.
Right. One of the things that just came to mind as you mentioned the ownership of the Dallas Stars with Kamloops is I guess access and more intimate knowledge of some of the players in the junior system, meaning like Stan Coven was a first round pick to Dallas. I didn't understand Dallas owned the Blazers, but some inside hockey there on some players. I know you as a director of player personnel, you guys are trying to, I mean, obviously we all go and watch the hockey player, but there's a lot of investigation on the player behind that hockey player too. So, I mean, you see a player day in and day out in Kamloops. I'm sure the scouts had a little more knowledge of what Logan was all about as a human too. So maybe that could be one of the advantages of ownership.
Well, I don't know if it's so much with ownership, but it's our own network. That's the biggest thing. And this is one thing I tell lots of young people trying to get into the business. Networking is a huge part of what we do. We certainly could reach out and talk to any scout from anywhere in the NHL. And we know all the guys in the West, whether they work for the Calgary Flames or the Edmonton Oilers or the Dallas Stars for that matter. I think the fact that we're owned by an NHL team doesn't really do a whole lot for us in that regard because, again, between our coaching staff, all our scouts, Jeff Chenouth, our GM, Mike Moore, who's our president and oversees both the Hitmen and the Roughnecks, we have a network of people that we deal with. And the other thing, Jason, which is so much different now, is the access to video, the access to Instat, which I can go on right now, pull up a player and watch his shift by shift situation. Don't get me wrong, though, I still love to watch players live because video doesn't tell the whole story in that. So, but anyway, yeah. Again, I think I'll come back to the point I made before. Network in this business is huge. You can reach out to people that you've crossed paths with and get some insight from them, whether it's on their character or whether it's whatever. There might be a red flag on a player, and you want to find out if there's any truth to it or not.
Right. So when you're considering junior A, or for these players considering junior A, I mean, generally the old way to do it was, if you wanted to go to school, you would go to junior A if that was the priority. And if you wanted a quicker route to pro, you would maybe consider major junior. With what major junior has been able to do now with the access to school, as part of the standard player contract, I think that's leveled the playing field a little bit, although the scholarships down to the States still aren't part of that deal. What are your thoughts on the development route in either? I know you mentioned already that they're both good leagues. I agree with you. I'm one of the few that did play in both. I know it was many years ago now. But how do you feel as a scout or even maybe just as giving advice to parents on how do you think it works between the two leagues?
Well, again, I think they're both very good options. But again, I guess I've become biased because I'm working in the Western Hockey League. But if I go back to my days starting in Penticton with an expansion franchise, and you played there in year 2, I mean, I think it was easier to recruit against the Western League because they talked about this and they talked about that. And I refer primarily to education. But back in those days, they did not deliver on that side. Players were not going to school. They weren't graduating from high school and all those things. That has changed unbelievable. And when we talk to players and parents about the Western Hockey League, there isn't one franchise in the Western League now that does not have a huge quality component of education in their program. It just doesn't happen anymore. So from a recruiting standpoint, we in the Western League have eliminated that issue. The other thing is everybody on the ice has a scholarship. Everybody on the ice in the other levels does not have a scholarship. And those scholarships that are earned are guaranteed. We know that the NCAA scholarships aren't guaranteed. I mean, it works out for many players. But there's lots of tough stories. But we have the same issue with us. I mean, guys come to our league and they don't have success. And again, it happens. I mean, but in saying that, when they're done, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years in, they've still got a scholarship in the bank. And also, while they're playing on a team, they can continue to take courses, and that doesn't even eat into that's an additional scholarship situation. So if a player takes a course or 2 courses while he's out of high school and playing within the league, that's all paid for as well.
Well, that's excellent. Is it how does that work? I'm unfamiliar. Is it 1 year of service equals 1 year of university? Is that how that works?
That's basically how it was all structured. It used to be if you're on the October 10th roster, you got a half a year. If you were on the January 10th roster, you got another half a year. If you start at 16, you can grow your scholarship to being 5 years. But there's been some things done. There's a little more upfront. It varies from player to player, but there is some wiggle room to negotiate. Top end players now we are guaranteeing them before they even play a game that it could be 2 or 3 years of education. It doesn't happen for every player, but that's a possibility out there. The other thing is if a player comes late to the league, such as an 18-year-old, he's still in a position to earn 1 at 18, 1 at 19, and 2 as an overage.
Oh,
I mean, that's not guaranteed that he'll be an overage, but it is there. So I guess the one thing that for me that that I'd like to discuss is for young players 16, 17, 18, I don't think you can put yourself into a better environment than major junior hockey, the Western Hockey League, because you're playing against all the top players. Your teammates are the top players. So your runway to the NHL is shorter, but I think you have less time. Where if you play a couple of years of junior A and then go to college hockey, the runway is a little longer. So probably works a little better maybe for late developers. But again, I really believe players that are 16, 17, and 18, they're just in a great spot to grow and develop because they're playing against their best players at their peer group.
Yeah, the best competition.
For the most part. I mean, we all know that quality players go the other direction from time to time as well.
Sure. Paul Carey would be a good example of an early one, right? That obviously went on to be a Hockey Hall of Famer. And we have another one in our midst here, Cale Makar, who graduate from the AJHL. That's obviously a heck of a player too. I think the hard part for both of those, and it comes to scouts and the players, and I know I was in that position too. And I mean, my story has kind of been told on this podcast in bits and pieces, but for me, going to the BCJ at that time, the 15-year-olds were allowed. 15-year-olds weren't allowed at Spokane though. Like that rule had been changed already. So junior A tier 1, 15-year-olds could play. They couldn't play at Spokane. I had to wait to be a 16-year-old. So for me, that was like the next best step as far as we thought from our environment, because it was either that or midget hockey, and obviously the BCJ was better than midget. So to your point, right, like let's play against the best players available, and push yourself. To go to Spokane, my dad was able to negotiate kind of like what maybe was more of a modern day deal, but we actually had 4 years of guaranteed university before I played a game at a American college, whatever that number would have been, what was inserted into the contract, which I was grateful for. As soon as I signed a pro deal, that guarantee went away, right?
That's the same, Jason. That's the same with the standard player agreement now. As soon as you sign an NHL pro contract, the entry level, your package is no longer there.
The package isn't there.
Yeah.
So that was the same for me. But to your point, maybe I'll go a little bit farther. In retrospect, for me and on my career, like I played pro, last cut from Florida as a 20-year-old, played pro in the AHL, played the majority of my NHL games that rookie season at 29. And was a point of game player in the AHL that season as well. And for the next 2-3 years, I led the AHL in goals one of the seasons when I was there, I think at 21 or 22. But it was funny because 23, 24, it was almost like because for whatever reason hadn't graduated to the NHL, that you're not a prospect anymore. You're a suspect, as they call it. And these players were coming out of college, like my peers that were actually even older than me in some scenarios, yet they were the shiny new penny. And it was to your point, it's kind of interesting because you're in the mix and you do got to make it happen. I think some guys do make it at 25, 26, 27 from the AHL. I mean, there are those stories, but for me and how it worked for me, I almost, as much as I love Spokane, as much as I love Major Juniors, where all of my memories are, had some fantastic seasons there. I would have loved to have seen what that whole college journey would have been like, right? And allowing yourself a little bit more time, like you say, to develop and get a little bit older and mature, I guess.
But today, Jason, guys aren't going there for 4 or 5 years anymore.
That's
they go there for 1 or 2 years, and for business reasons, they got to take the contract. It's not going to be any better.
Yeah,
entry-level contract's an entry-level contract, whether you sign it at 18 or whether you sign it at 20, again, for me, development is such an interesting thing. And we have this discussion constantly week in and week out when you're discussing with scouts and a term that's quite often used by a good friend of mine. Everybody triggers at a different time. And why is that? Well, that's just the way it is out there. You land if you had landed in a different scenario in the NHL, some coach might have fallen in love with you, so to speak. Let's say that. And again, sometimes it's being in the right place at the wrong time, or vice versa. And I've had that happen to me outside of playing. I mean, COVID hit 2 years ago, and all of a sudden I don't have a job any longer, and now I'm with the Calgary Hitmen. But again, development is an interesting thing, and we could probably discuss this for hours and hours, and never. There isn't a perfect path or anything. But I do also think the guys that make decisions on where they want to go and how they want to get there, and they get on with it and focus on it, I think they tend to have success. And I mean, your NHL career was, will I say, brief to say the least, I guess. But you played a long time, and I think anybody that looks at your resume, and I did today just to bring myself up to snuff with it, there you played a long time and did very well for yourself as a pro hockey player. I'm sure you would have liked to have played 1,000 games in the NHL, but that didn't happen. But again, I'm sure you wouldn't trade it in for anything. And it's just like when I started coaching, I said that at some point I want to make this my first coaching job. I was still teaching school in Manitoba. I told my wife I'd like to make this my profession, and whatever it leads to, it leads to. And it's filled a suitcase up and emptied a few times, but no. But again, back to the whole development path. It's like I say, we could discuss this till the cows come home, and still, I think every player and his family and his people that are advising them, they have to analyze it and make a decision that makes sense for them.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Just going to take a short break here to talk about the Peak Potential Hockey Project. I have been receiving lots of interest about the course. It's my 4-week mindset and personal development program for hockey players and teams. That a lot of teams have been reaching out to me. This is where I am extending my focus right now. Team development is an awesome way for me to reach more players at once and have a bigger impact with the message. So I love working with competitive teams, whether male or female, whether junior, major junior, junior A, junior B, you name it. Competitive players from U13 on up. This is for you. If you have any interest at all in providing mindset development and personal development to your players, to empower them to grow the confidence to be the best players that they can be, to have the tools required to be accountable to their development on their terms, so they are the ones that are feeling responsible for what is happening around them, this is something that you should consider. The testimonials on the upmyhockey.com page speak for themselves. This is making a huge difference for players and teams, and I'm super excited to be offering it this year as my main signature program. So once again, you can reach out to me on the website, upmyhockey.com. Jason@upmyhockey.com is my email handle. This is for teams. There also is an individual way to take the program as well, but please look into it if you are at all interested in getting your player support or whether you are interested in getting your team support. This will make a massive difference for your player or your team. Now back to the episode with Garry Davidson. Yeah, great points. And I actually had a podcast listener email me last week about development at the younger ages, and it's the same discussion at the older ages, and the discussion about whether to play AAA hockey or travel hockey in this gentleman's situation, or to play down a level. So instead of, it sounded like his player was sort of, would have been one of the last picks for the team, like was probably good enough. But felt maybe it'd be better to hold them back so they would have more puck touches, gain more confidence, that type of scenario. I'm sure that discussion happens with you guys at your level too. Do you want the kid to be in and out of the lineup at 16 and being around the environment and being around the players and seeing what it's all about, or should it be playing AAA midget and being the first power play guy? Like, do you generally have a dog in that fight as far as the approach?
Well, that's definitely the discussion. It happened earlier this morning again with myself and Jeff Chenout there. We discussed, 16-year-olds. In fact, sometimes it's 17-year-olds that where should they be? So the rule in the Western Hockey League is if you're a 16-year-old, you have to dress for 40 games. If you're 16-year-old in junior A, you don't have any restrictions. Therefore, we're held a little bit more accountable. But back to your comment, like, do you want the 16-year-old as number 13 forward or number 12? Or should he be back and be a top 3 guy in another program? And for me, one of the things is once a player has really achieved that level, I think it's now time to move on. Now, some players will never, they're always just going to be average at whatever league. But it's amazing how guys can do that. Average minute becomes an average Western Hockey League or junior hockey player who becomes an average NHLer. That's the way it works. Yeah. He understands what he is and he plays to his abilities and he earns a roster spot and keeps moving up to the next levels. But there are lots of players that I think need to stay at a level a year longer. But again, there's lots of peer pressure. There's lots of parent pressure and that we got to be there today. Well, that may not be the best. That may not be best for that player's development.
Yeah, I agree. I had Jerome McGinley on. Obviously, everyone knows who Jerome McGinley is, and he was part of that Kamloops Blazer dynasty era, right, of 10 years running, where they were, Memorial Cup contenders every year, and he played at 16 and only played. To your point, like, I don't know what it was. I can't remember. It's not in front of me, but he definitely was a healthy scratch for very many games. And some of the games that he did dress in, at least in the first half, he retold that sometimes he didn't even get on the ice till the third period or the second half of the game, depending on the score. Now, that was a tough year for him, self-admittedly. Pardon me?
Interesting part to that, though, he was also never drafted in the Bantam draft. He was a protected list player later. I don't know if you knew that.
Well, I think Jerome, I don't want to say you're wrong on that, but I think I was the last generation of WHL. It was me, Travis Clayton, and somebody else. And the next year, everyone was available. I think Jerome was like a 8th overall pick or something, I believe. I'd have to look that up.
I might be wrong on that, but I think he's one of those guys, just like Shea Weber was sitting in Sycamoose. He didn't get drafted.
Right.
Played at 15, a few AP games for us in Salmon Arm, and Kelowna put him on their list, and next year he was in Kelowna, and the rest is history.
Yeah, no kidding.
But there have been a number of players that, for one reason or another, did not get picked in the Bantam draft. And that's the other message I always try to deliver to players. Once a draft's over, I really don't care where you got picked or if you got picked. If I see potential in you, then we're going to come knocking on your door, whether you're a first round, an 8th round, or a listed player. And I've got plenty of examples of all of those where some first rounders don't work out and some 8th rounders are in the NHL today, because I've had a couple of those guys that's happened for, but again, for me, that's another thing that you come back to players look at. It's only an evaluation at a certain period in your development. Right. And today you're not overly desired by teams because you didn't get drafted, but then next year all of a sudden, bang, you start to grow and develop. And did you play with Stu Boddicker in Penticton? I'm trying to remember if you remember Stewie.
Well, he was a part of my friend group, but he wasn't there. I think we're the same.
I think he must have come the year before. Well, Stu was a classic example. At 16, he just exploded, and I use him as an example. He was a Canuck draft, went to Colorado College, but he just exploded from one year to the next and made the jump to the BC Hockey League. And what also brings me back to the other thing, he probably should have stayed one more year at our level before he went to college, because he physically wasn't ready to move to the next level. I mean, he still did fine, but back to what we talked about. When's it time to move from this level to the next level? That's part of the whole analyzing your situation and understanding what you need to continue to grow your game and get to your final goal, which I presume most players, it's the NHL.
Right. No, I like what you said there. I mean, I'm gonna get back to the Bantam draft for sure. I like your approach with like dominate the league you're in. I also like you mentioning, because that's one of the things that I talk about on my platform and with the players that I work with, is understanding who you are, right? Like, so dominating the level, to your point, like an up and down winger that likes to play physical and get to the paint. I mean, he's never going to be a 1.5, 2 point a game guy, regardless of where he is, right? But if he accepts that and does that well where he's at, then yeah, it is time for him to move on. So it's not always point specific, right? How much you're dominating and how you're impacting the games you're in. But back to my story about Jerome, because I think that's relevant, is like there was a classic scenario where a lot of kids 16 wouldn't have been able to do that, especially being the player that he was, like to be able to be there. But he reflects on that time at 16 and saying that was exactly, as hard as it was for me to be around that group, for me to be around those players, to see what they did every day. And so it set me up for the next year, whereas some players aren't ready for that grind, right?
Yeah.
That's sitting out. And I think that's got to be something that's taken into consideration too. And oftentimes parents specifically don't have a clear looking glass when they're looking at their player. And it's always about the hockey skills and the hockey talent. Is like, can your player handle what might be coming here? Because that's
I think we're talking about handling adversity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing that I think is very important. We all have to handle some adversity from time to time. It's not always going to be easy and a piece of cake. And for some players, when they're very young, they never face adversity. Then they climb up through the ladder of youth hockey, and then all of a sudden, bang, they face some adversity. And now some of them learn to deal with it. And you said Jerome did, and I'm sure he did, because look what he did after that. But there's other players that they just never do figure that out and handle that very well. And because of it, they never maximize their potential. Because all of a sudden, it's like the guy that's the natural, the Gretzky. It's so easy for him. But it's so easy for him, he doesn't understand how it was so difficult for this other guy who plugged and plodded along year after year and had to scratch and scrape to make a rostered spot. And again, it's interesting when you look at all the coaches you had, how many of them were those kind of players? They scratched and scraped,
yep.
To get there, and because they faced all that adversity and understood all that stuff, and probably benefited their players, that experience and that. So,
mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that networking thing is ringing a bell with me. I mean, even what you're saying there. I mean, I played for you at 15, and was a top prospect growing up, and would by lots was considered the natural, and I had a hard time breaking in. I don't think it was the adversity of having that be an issue, but there's definitely there's a way to go about breaking through, right? And I think the guys that have had more experience with that, getting onto teams and breaking through and proving people wrong, and like the more calloused you are in that sense, I think the better prepared you are too for what's ahead, And so I can remember times moping around and saying, why am I here? Right? Like, why is this me, and what's going on? And maybe spent too long in that personal space. And one of the things I help players with now is that ability to change that perspective, for sure. I think it is a learned trait. But yeah, to your point, I think coaches a lot of times have an affinity for those types of players. They resonate with them, right? They understand what they're going through and them showing up to the rink, and they want those guys to succeed. So, I mean, I totally understand the human condition when it comes to that, and that is how it works a lot of the time, right?
Most definitely. I think my wife always uses the good sailors don't learn to sail in calm waters. She uses that all the time, and I think it is very applicable to everything in life, that, a rough sea teaches you to sail better. So dealing with some adversity and some setbacks, I guess, whether they're short term, you get benched for a game or two, or you have to go back and play another year at a lesser level or a lower level, whether that be a midget age player that doesn't make it the jump to junior, he has to go back for a year. So yeah, it's an interesting business.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is. Do you see? And everyone has kind of a different lens who they're looking through, but and depends on who I talk to. But do you see? You've been around the game, obviously, in some capacity for years. So you've seen like the game change. You've seen the rule changes. You've seen a ton of things. Do you see the actual person that's the hockey player? Has that changed at all? Like, are they more resilient, less resilient? Are they more prepared for adversity or less? Or do you think it's just been the same essentially through the decades?
Well, first of all, the game has changed immensely. That's the first thing. I mean, it is so fast. You, you have to process the game very quickly. Your hands and feet have to be at a certain level. You have to be able to skate now. I mean, it's changed. And back to the day when you got started in the early 90s, I mean, it was clutch and grab, and the play away from the puck was atrocious. And I had spent 7 years in Europe before I came back, and it drove me nuts to watch how good players got eliminated from the game because, and lots of them had to go to Europe to have any success because they couldn't play the ridiculous game we were playing here in North America. So I'm really excited to see how the game has grown and developed in that regard. Now, when it comes to dealing with the young players, I think people always say this, oh, back 20 years ago, it was different. I think the only thing that's different is our society is really different. And our players and our young players are a product of the society. And again, that for me is probably a big issue. And again, right now it's a very expensive game to play. So there's a lot of kids that can't afford to play. Well, that's unfortunate. We've lost probably a lot of good athletes in the game because of it. The playing with no consequences. Like, I mean, I have two sons, basically around your age, two granddaughters now, and I just look at the differences. Like, they are so worldly so early now. But on the other hand, I mean, they're a product of what we're doing in our school systems, in our sports systems. And then there's the other thing. How many of them are really lacking any help from parents? Some get tremendous support and help, almost overboard. So it's non-consequential thing. To other players that, God, they're getting no help, and they need lots of help and support, and it's not there. And it's a society thing for me, and things that are happening in hockey are happening everywhere in society, and again, that's the biggest change I think for me, Jason, is how that's changed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think people are people, and they are a product. I mean, some would maybe call my wife and my approach old school when it comes to parenting. I don't know if it is or not. I don't even know if what you would call it, but like, I do see less accountability, I think, in, like you said, in the system. I mean, whether it be school or whether it be in sports, like ownership on the player to take some control over what it is that they're all about and what they want and the consequences of right and wrong action. So, I mean, we try and do our best to facilitate their decision-making processes. And I guess as a coach in hockey, I kind of see that a little bit. I feel there's a little bit of entitlement. Like, I should just get this, not necessarily I should have to earn this type of mentality. And so I don't know if that's a cross section of society or if that's any different than when I was a kid. I'm sure it probably isn't. I'm sure you probably had to deal with that in 1990, just like you have to deal with in 2022. But that's one of the fun things for me is like working with players and getting them to understand they're like empowering them with those decisions, right? And empowering them with the consequences of those decisions, because as you empower a player, boy, forget about the power skating. You get percentage increases just by having them take responsibility of what they're all about. I love seeing that personally.
And that's what we're talking about with the society. I mean, I think many years ago, there was a lot more consequence for people when they made a decision, whether it was positive or negative. But today, we have this non-consequence society going now. You can mess up, and you never pay the price for it. I mean, it's if people aren't happy with with the results of something, then they go buy a hockey team and they go do this and they go do that and create another program and all these other things. So yeah, it's for me, it's a real change in society. It really is.
I want to talk, you know what, that your comment, you maybe have an interesting perspective on it. I want to get back to WHL draft because for my listeners, that's a really important piece of time, and parents are doing a lot to position their players for that. And myself, I'm in that same scenario. My oldest is going to be WHL draftable next year, and he's wanting to play in a certain spot. So I definitely want to talk about WHL draft. But when it comes to the private leagues now, and I don't know your involvement or not, but the academy system is obviously flourishing. That program has done real well. There's also the HSL up here in Western Canada, in Alberta, and there's the HPL in British Columbia, which is definitely fragmented where players can go and players can go. I see positives and negatives to it. What's your do you have a horse in the race there when it comes to that, to these private leagues that are showing up?
Well, again, I think we've got too many hockey teams. That's, for me, the bottom line. Whether they're driven by a local association or whether they're driven by a Canadian sports school situation or these new things that are popping up, it's unbelievable, Jason, how many midget programs and bantam programs are out there, because I'm out there having to go and cover off on them. We just keep creating more and more and more. And this is all a product of decisions made many years ago. And I'll point the finger, not that Hockey Canada had a residency rule many years ago, which meant you had to play where you lived. Good, bad, that was the policy. But what did that do? It created spring hockey. So the player playing in this small association who was a top player there would join up with another 15 or 16 elite players, I guess you'd call them, and they'd have a spring team. From there, somebody said, I'm going to run a business. I'm going to attract those kids to come and play from September 1 to June 30th in our sports school. So that's all the changes that are happening. I'm wondering what the next evolution will be, but that is what's happened. And again, it's easy for me to sit back now. It's all hindsight, but I've always had an issue with some of those early residency rules. I'll give you the example of when I arrived in Salmon Arm here, Shea Weber had to play in Sicamous. Fortunately, at 15, he was still allowed to play Junior B. He couldn't go down the road to Salmon Arm, a AA association, or he couldn't. So, that's what happened. And again, I guess 10 years from now, we'll write the critique on what's happened. But that's how things have changed. Now, again, I'll come back to my original comment. There's far too many hockey teams. There are too many hockey teams at every level. It's ridiculous. You played in Penticton in a 10-team BC Hockey League, and there are only 2 Western League teams out in British Columbia.
Right.
Well, now there's 22 teams in the Western League. There's 18 teams in the BC Hockey League. The KIJHL went from a 10-team league, which was very good. I think they got 24 teams. And now what we've done, we've gone into the minor ranks, and we've created elite provincial leagues, local AA leagues, and now we got these other spin-offs, the sports school leagues and these other things. I mean, boy, I don't know where it's going to end, but I know one thing. We don't have more hockey players. So what do we got? I think we got a very watered down product. And again, we've got a very expensive product too. It's very expensive to play the game now, unbelievably expensive. So I don't have the answers for those concerns I'm voicing, but that's kind of what's happened in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, it's nice for what you just said. I mean, as a parent, I think the side of the coin I think is good is that there is options for people. So hopefully, like, these products are providing players that maybe wouldn't get a chance some exposure to good coaches, maybe better players that maybe they wouldn't have had otherwise.
Well, and that's part of that thing. I mean, you're stuck in a small community, and if you were lucky, there was a couple of pretty good hockey players as parents in that community. And boy, for about 5 or 6 years, you'd see some great things happening. Then there'd be a lull in that community because the leadership and who was involved didn't have the same to offer and to help grow and develop the young players at that period of time. So, yeah, it's again, it's something we are always talking about. And again, the one thing is if a player really wants to be a player, I think it's going to happen for him. And he might spend 1 year in a lesser glamorous situation, but if he's focused and driven and wants to be a player, like we always say, go to the rink, you'll find a hockey player. And that's what we do, or we try to do. We try to get to the arena as much as we can and watch as many hockey players, and because you just never know when you walk in the rink who's on the ice and who you might see there.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I love that. Yeah, I mean the one thing to your point, I mean, I wish I had the solution for the expense too, because it's getting expensive everywhere, and you want your best athletes being able to play. It helps our game, it helps everything, and I don't have the solution to that either. That's for another conversation. I think it is a good one to hot stove though, because it's getting a little bit crazy right now. But the one thing I do think is missing with the private stuff, and this is just for me, is that I do believe I still see hockey as a grassroots community thing. Like that's where it starts, like your hometown association, going to school with your buddies, playing on your local team, and going to go play the rival team. And there's just like a culture about that's community based and with the local community sponsors and all that stuff that I think is really good for the game. And when we have people going different places all the time, at a young age, it kind of separates that. And that's maybe a little bit nostalgic by me, but that is something that I think is cool. I do understand the wish for people to try and find the best opportunity available, but sometimes we're talking we're talking small margins here, and what are you giving up to make that happen? But anyways, we won't get stuck in the mud on that.
I think that's a good point though, Jason, and I really think that when you look at the situation now, that I really struggle with 13 and 14-year-old boys and girls for that matter, because that's happening for the females as well, leaving home and going off to a situation. I think they should be at home with their parents and their friends and in their own school. Yeah. When it's time to leave, I'm not sure, but 13 and 14 for me seems to be I believe that's too young, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's some play. I mean, it's happening everywhere, but there's lots of players, even our home association, that are, it's not that long of a drive, but choosing to go to West Kelowna or Kelowna, 30, 45 minutes down the road for their practices and stuff. And their kids are like 8, 9, 10 years old too, right? So again, like I say that with no judgment, because people are doing it because they want to, and they see something there. And I think that's the thing that Hockey Canada needs to look at, is like, why are people leaving? Like, what are we not doing? Is there something that we can do? I think there's probably some gaps that could be filled there, but I do love the days, Gary, like I said it to my boys now, right? I don't know. How do you tell who the best player is? Like back when we played, everyone was playing AAA, and that was the only place to play, right? Like you're in the league, you knew who all the players were. There was one league to watch. And then if you weren't, you're in AA or whatever the case may be. Now it's like, either you're in the school system, or you're in the zone program, or you're in the BC Hockey AAA system. And like, there's not one place for that everybody is, which I'm sure makes it hard on you guys, which maybe is a good segue to the WHL draft. It seems like to me the academy system, the prep system, the U15 prep system that they have here in British Columbia is the most widely scouted league. It seems that's where most of the players are coming from. And even watching the AAA, U15 AAA level, the BC Hockey equivalent, there seems to be like some top scorers in that don't get drafted. Is that because they're not getting watched? Or can you maybe explain how you guys go about your business when it comes to the WHL draft?
Well, last year was a tough year, Jason, because we had to do 2 drafts. I mean, it was unbelievable. This year's a piece of cake for me, as far as I'm concerned. We got 1 year to watch all these 08s. So last year was a bit of an unusual circumstance. But for me, I mean, I look at our 07 draft. I mean, we took sports school players. We took BC and Alberta Elite League players. So I mean, we're trying to cover off on all of it. And some of those new leagues we got out and watched a little bit as well. Not me so much me personally, but our scouts got out, and I know they're going to be out early here to watch some of these new entities, if I might use that word, that are springing up. Yeah, we try to get out there and cover every '08 we can, and it's a tough job, and certainly you're dealing with very very young people, physically and very much so mentally and emotionally. So it's a tough order. But again, if players are committed and working hard in their own environment, I think they got a chance to be recognized and get a chance to be selected in the draft. But again, I'll come back to what I said before. If that doesn't happen, just get to a camp and show everybody, hey, you missed me, because that happens constantly.
And I would assume it's you're less invested. Maybe that's the wrong word, but the NHL level. I mean, you have your first rounders, your second rounders, third rounders, and they get longer looks. Like, there's no question, right? Like you get a few more chances. Like you're in the system. There's a little more invested. There's still room for other players at the NHL level. It happens all the time, but generally there's a little more focus on the top guys. At the WHL level, do you find that to be also the case, or is there just room for the best player? Is that all you're looking for all the time at that level?
Well, I think you're trying to focus on the players that have the most talent, the most upside, the most growth that can happen with their game. Now, but again. I know sometimes you pick a player and you fall in love with him, and he isn't what you thought he was. And those are the tough ones. And as a scout, or in my case, the director of player personnel, we have to identify that, hey, we messed up there. That player isn't what we thought he was, and we also have to say, hey, I really like that player. He's never been drafted, and we better be following this guy. So it's real interesting. And again, I come back to the I said it again at our training camp this year. We had close to 80 players there, and many of them were free agents, undrafted. And I said, hey, you just keep plugging away, because there's lots of stories of the guys that don't get picked in the draft. And again, there's lots of stories where guys were. I just watched Kelowna play the other night. Their 12th round defenseman has made the team at 16. Like that's pretty neat story. And we had Carter Hart and Everett, and we picked him in the 8th round. That's how smart we were. But 21 other teams passed on him 7 times, and we selected him in the 8th round. And he ends up being a world-class junior goalie, and now he's an NHL player. But yeah, again, I just keep telling guys. Guys will say, well, where'd you pick that guy? I said, I can't remember. Doesn't matter anymore whether he was an early pick, a late pick, or he wasn't picked at all. You try to forget the bad picks you make and remember those late picks you make too, though, in the business. But the Bantam draft is a very, very difficult thing, but the NHL draft is every bit as difficult. Yeah. I mean, you can go and look at the drafting process for the last 10 years with some NHL teams. Holy mackerel. They had a lot of misses and very few hits, because it's not an easy thing to do.
Oh, I believe it. Just going to take a short break from the episode to share a testimonial from a junior A hockey coach, Mr. Tyler Shattuck of the Salmon Arm Silverbacks, who last year I had the opportunity to work with. The entire team took the Peak Potential Hockey Project. We discussed it as a team, and I worked with the individuals on that team on some of the aspects there within. And Salmon Arm, and I'm not going to take complete credit for this, obviously, but had a career season. They were second in the BCHL in points. They had a good playoff run, and by all means had a very, very successful campaign. And Tyler was nice enough to share a testimonial with me, which I'll read now. And he says, I immediately saw the benefits of working with Jason and his program. Our players were more adept in handling adversity, letting go of frustration, and even using it as a tool for performance. Jason's knowledge of the game, combined with his expertise in mental coaching, played a significant role in our team's performance on and off the ice. I would highly recommend Jason to any athlete or team looking to increase mental toughness for an athletic advantage. Tyler Shattuck, head coach, Salmon Arm Silverbacks, BCHL. I'm super grateful for Tyler for writing that. Obviously, working with a team in the BCHL, which is one of the best feeder systems, best feeder leagues for D1 scholarships in the United States, providing players to the D1 program. It's awesome that I was able to work with them and to share with those athletes. Now, on the minor level or on a level of like U midget or U18, U15, U13, this program works. I also have testimonials from those levels that I'm not going to share with you right now for obvious reasons, but just to give you an idea that the impact this can have on your organization, on your collective group of players. Each player will take the content within and apply it to themselves differently, but it does provide a culture and a platform, a foundation to grow peak performance, which is essentially what we are all wanting as coaches and as managers and as associations. We want the best out of the individuals to come together collectively to provide a better product and get better outcomes. And that is exactly what this does. It empowers the players to become better teammates, to allow themselves to be better on the ice and to get what they want, which is their individual goals and dreams to be fulfilled. So if this is something you're interested in, if this is something you would like to know more about, by all means, check out my website, upmyhockey.com. The program is listed there under services. You can also reach out to me on the contact form, and we can chat about your team and whether it will be a good solution for them. Now, back to the episode with Garry Davidson. When it comes to that, I think it's about a third of the league, isn't it? Roughly 30% is undrafted players, or do you know that number? I knew that at one point.
Yeah, I honestly haven't looked into that, but I've always said that you build a team in three ways: through the draft, through listing players, and then obviously you have to make the odd trade here to fill in where maybe you have a shortcoming. And it also depends on the cycle of your team. I mean, if you got a really good team and you want to make a push, then you're going to acquire, somebody in a trade, and so a team is built that way. But I could quickly pull up our list and count it. But I know we got lots of free agents, as I call them, or list players on our group.
Yeah.
So the percentage, I'm not sure, but I think people would be surprised how high it is.
I wouldn't mind spending just a touch of time just from a not contract, but why things are done the way they're done. And you said last year was so difficult because you had to do the two drafts. The WHL is the only major junior league in Canada that drafts 14-year-old kids, and everyone else waits one more year. It seemed to me it would make your job a little easier. You get one more year to watch these guys. They're a little bit closer to being WHL ready. And last year seemed like the absolute perfect opportunity to make that happen. Let's just change the draft age. Do you know why it was left or why it's not been changed? Like what, as far as that's concerned?
Well, as a GM in Everett for almost 10 years, I was a component of going to the midget draft. I think there's several other people that feel that way too, but there's also the group that have been doing it this way for a long time. And they have their reasons why they prefer the Bantam draft. I don't agree with them, but that's the way it is. And I'm in an environment where I'm in a position of overseeing our draft and overseeing our scouts. So we have to get out and watch those Bantam 08s, and we got to pick them in May. That's the business. And whether it'll change, it was the ideal time, in my opinion, to change it. But again, it didn't happen, so we just moved forward. But there's been lots of talk. Why doesn't the NHL push their draft back 1 year too?
Yeah.
And there's people out there that are in favor of that, but there's lots of people that aren't as well. So.
Yeah. Was that is that a voted thing then? Just for my own curiosity, is it a GM vote on whether that changes or not? Is there other people that's involved in that?
Well, first of all, anything that the GMs do that's just passed on to the ownership and the governors to make the final decision. So let's say we had a vote on a certain thing within the GMs and it passed, then it's taken to the ownership group, the governors, and they put their stamp on it, yes or no. And in the case of changing the draft, one day it was kind of going this direction, the next day it was heading back the other direction. And as it turned out, it stayed.
Right.
And again, I think if you poll the GMs, one day it might pass and the next day it may not. And it's the same with the governors for that matter too. So
when it comes to the draft, I didn't do it for this past draft year, and I actually want to. But it seems, and to me, I guess for obvious reason, that players are more widely selected with earlier birth dates than later birth dates. They're 9 months older, it's 11 months older in some cases. 11 months is a lot of growing time and a lot of developing time. Is that something when you're looking at players that, I know you guys are aware of the birth date, but do you try to factor that in, what this player might be if they had another year, sometimes of development under their belt?
Big time. I do. So when I watch a player and he's a December, November birth date, I circle that because he's now playing against a kid born in January or February. There's a huge difference. I mean, huge difference. So the January, February birth date, he might get to where he needs to be at 18. The other kid, it might be 19, but he's going to get there. Right. And again, that's the other thing when you're watching players is you got to be careful. You're not picking a guy because he's simply physically more mature than the other kid. You see the kid that's 5'3" and weighs 115 pounds. And the other kid's 6'1" and he's already 180 pounds. I mean, that's a mismatch, like big time. But you got to look by that. And that's the one thing I've tried to really encourage. And we did in Portland when I arrived there, in Everett, and now in Calgary. Let's not focus on size as being the be-all to drafting players. Because for me, it's great if the guy's 6'2" and weighs 200 pounds opposed to the same guy that's 5'10", weighs 160, if they're equally skilled. But it boils back to me, Jason, the other factors are more important. And again, at 14, that 5'3" guy, you didn't know his dad was 6'4" and his uncle was 6'4", and all of a sudden when he's a year away, you're looking, RinkNet still has this guy at 5'3", 140. I'm looking, cripes, he's over 6 feet now. That's what happened. So again, when it comes to evaluating a talent, I think, obviously a guy that has reach and range, which you had, is an important thing. I mean, Mr. Chera, who just retired today, had the best reach and range in the world at 6, whatever he was. He could stick his stick out one way and his hand out the other way, and you couldn't get by the guy. So that it was an important aspect once as he moved forward. But again, when we're dealing with bantam age kids, I mean, size for me is something that we have to be very careful of because we have no idea. Guy will say, he's got big feet, he's going to grow. Really? I saw that same kid 2 years later. He still got big feet, but he didn't grow. But, it's so again. I think it's one of those things you have to be very careful. We talk about the things that are most important and I tell all the players it's all about head, hands, feet, and heart. Those are the things that are important because we know that sometimes the drive and the fight and the heart in the little guy is way better, more than the big guys. So those are things that come into it. So, right. And then of course, the thing, Jason, that's probably the most difficult in the bantam draft is dealing with what kind of people you're drafting because they are so young and so immature. You don't know what kind of a character you've got, and certainly you got to be careful. You're not writing a 14-year-old off because he did something that you perceive as being not a good character thing.
Right.
Because again, you got to be careful of that.
Sure.
It might be just a bad decision for a young 14 to make one day and, so forth. So, but
How do you, I mean, I know that that's definitely something that is looked into, and I think more so with the higher picks. You may have had a conversation with NHL GMs, and they're definitely personally involved in the first pick for sure, and maybe the second one, and they want to know. I mean, you kind of do more homework because there's more invested there. Is that something that at that level, Gary, when you're dealing with, like you said, these 14-year-old kids, is it just what you're seeing at the rink, or are you trying to find out what they're like in school and what they like are with their friends or their teammates? Or are you doing some homework on that to try and find out?
Yeah, and I think that's really a responsibility for our regional scouts, because they know probably parents, they know the coaching staff. So, if there's a red flag, then we note it. There's a red flag. If there's enough red flags, then maybe he isn't a first round pick because of that, and also what comes into it, Jason, is how committed they are to the Western League too. I mean,
right.
Especially last year with the 2 drafts. I mean, we red flagged some very good players because our 06 pick was 12th overall. We had to make sure the player wanted to come and play for us. I had it happen in Everett. We drafted this Tyson Jost young man and went to Penticton, played at North Dakota, and we lost out on that deal because he was a 7th overall pick in the Bantam draft. So you gotta, and then still there's no guarantee. I mean, you can pick them and people change their mind a year down the road or 2 years down the road too. So.
Yeah. You said parents there, and that wasn't even on my hit list, but I think it's worth mentioning because maybe there's a message to parents out there, or maybe there isn't. Parents, to me, seem really, really involved now. I guess probably they always were. How can parents negatively or positively impact a player when it comes to through the eyes of the scouts or an organization?
I guess the quick answer is yes, but on the other hand, I always tell our guys again, players don't pick their parents. They don't pick their parents. So let's be careful here. We're not writing off a player because we have a problem with their way of parenting or what they're all about in that. But again, there's no question. I think some parents, have been a detriment in their child's involvement in the game, which can eventually can cause an issue, I guess, in the draft. But again, we're very careful of that. Somebody might say, well, mom and dad are a real handful. Well, so what? I mean, I think the player's a hell of a player. So, I mean, we got to, I've dealt with coaches that don't want to deal with parents. And I said, hold it here now. You have to deal with parents. Their son's only 16 years old, 17 years old. We have to deal with parents. We have to deal now with agents too. That's part of our job. And I'm not going to, if you as a parent phone me tomorrow and have an issue, we're going to sit down and talk about it and figure it out and sort it out. But there are lots of people in this business just say, hey, I don't want anything to do with it. Well, that doesn't work for me. I mean, if they were all 19 and older and they're all adults, well, maybe that's a different story. Now, it's time for Johnny there to stand on his own 2 feet and deal with, coaches and management on a one-to-one basis that way.
Yeah. Oh, good for you. I mean, I think if there's one thing I can say about the game today, yes, I do love the speed. I love the skill. There's some aspects where I wish there was a little more physicality involved as far as what I'm seeing, but what I love about the transition has been the support and the recognition of what you just said, that we're dealing with young people, right? Like that aren't ready for a lot of this stuff. And the way it was in the past of, just figure it out essentially, and you're only mentally tough if you can do that. I like the approach, the coaching approach now, the approach from organizations as a whole, it seems to be getting better and be more pro person instead of just an asset as a player. And I think the teams that are getting it right, Gary, the ones that are getting the best results and are getting the best out of their assets are the ones that are taking care of the person the best. And I think that evolution has been really great to see.
Well, and again, I think that's back to what I talked about. I mean, the Western Hockey League is now, I think they got an outstanding education component to all the programs. And that's important because very few of our players in the end are going to be pro hockey players. So they need to go to school. They need to get educated. They need to be looked after and nurtured, and not only on the ice, but off the ice too, because we don't know what's in store for them when they get to be 20 or 23 years old. So, it's and again, there's been times where there's been isolated situations that people just take a pop shot at, but there's been a lot of good things done in the game here in the last, for my time, I can remember back in the day. I mean, the game on the ice was pretty violent at times. The hazings and all those other things, which were happening everywhere in society too. I mean, all those things have been looked at and addressed. They haven't been totally eliminated, but boy, are we in a much better place today than we were, 10 years ago, or for sure 30 years ago when you and I crossed paths back in Penticton.
No, for sure. Back to the Bantam draft, maybe would be my last question as far as like the leagues again and the amount of coverage you guys have to have. And I will reiterate what you said. I mean, if you're a player, the draft, the draft isn't the end all be all. You will get found. Keep playing. But do you find most of the scouts are at the academy schools? Is that deemed the top league to scout? Is that where the best players are?
Well, I think there's no doubt that right now the academies have the best players, but probably more importantly, they have more quality players. There are good players in every program, but the depth at the academies is substantially more. So you'll see a program might have 2 players picked, and another academy might have 6, 7, 8 guys picked. That's right. That's where it's at right now. But I can tell you right now, we picked 2 players out of the Thompson Blazers, BC Elite League, and we took several guys out of the academies as well, including our first 3 picks, this 07s, were 3 defensemen. One went to the academy, the other one played in Alberta, and the other one played in BC here. So,
right.
It's they're both good options, but one might be better for you as a family and your son or daughter than another program. So you got to figure that out.
Yes, well, I mean, back to your point, and why I bring that up is because it's nice to hear the stories, and not to say that the BC, elite option or the AAA option here or the Alberta one is cheap, because they're both, an investment for families, but they tend to be less expensive than the academy route. And I just deal with parents sometimes that, obviously are wanting to support their kids, want to support their dreams, and make like massive financial commitments that maybe is outside of their means to make this happen. And that's just where I get a little bit worried, because the expectations are so big and these things are happening. It's like you can take a breath, you can exhale, you will get seen in other leagues. And even if you don't get seen that year, there's definitely room to be a WHL player. It doesn't have to happen at 15 years old. So that was more one of the reasons why I wanted to bring that up, because it's expensive to play in those academies, and you do get a good program, and you do get a lot of extra ice and exposure, but some families just can't afford it, and it's okay if you can't.
No, I'm right on with it. The zone teams too. I mean, I slip out and watch the Bantam zone team here, and I certainly encourage our other scouts to do the same thing. I think one of our Kamloops picks there from the Blazers program, he played zone the year before as a first-year Bantam, and second year he went to the again, it's and again, I even look at the KIJHL for years. It was a junior B league. God, I found a lot of good hockey players in that league over the years, lots of them. And but what you do is, as a scout, you have to make sure that you have done your homework and researched who's playing where and who's out there. And
right.
And again, sometimes a player slips through the cracks, but he doesn't slip through forever. He might be missed this year, but they keep plugging away. They're going to get an opportunity.
Awesome. You said hands, feet, head, and heart. Maybe
and the fifth thing is character. Obviously, we've got to do a little work on that. But for me, that's all the skill stuff. How you process the game, how your hands work, how your feet work, and how you compete. And there's different levels of compete too. I mean, some guys compete like hell on offense. They don't do enough on defense. And there's other guys that work their butts off on defense, but their offensive commitment is somewhat limited because probably their hands or their head, they process the game isn't good enough. But yeah, those are the things that we look for. And I think that's generally what most organizations, and I just try to simplify it by head, hands, feet, and heart. It's pretty simple. You just you can expound upon all those four areas of evaluation. To define them a little more, obviously. Or feet. Some people have heavy feet, but they have good edges. Some people have unbelievable feet. And then there's some guys that get around the ice, but boy, are they laborsome. All those kinds of things come into it as you start to evaluate in more detail.
I was going to close though. So under that criteria, I mean that evaluation criteria, and players are, camps are now over, but I mean these podcasts last forever, and really the format here is meant to be educational and informative for those who are listening. So I think this the question will last the test of time, but. Players are always wondering, like, what can I do? I want to get noticed. How do I make a difference? I know what I tell these players, but like as a scout and someone in your position, how does somebody stand out from the crowd?
I think you have to bring what you do best to the ice surface. Don't try to be a dipsy doodler if that isn't in your game. If your game is your skating and your physical presence and things, that's what you have to do. And then you have to understand what your weaknesses are, and you have to grow that part of your game. And again, over the years, I've seen players that know what they are, and because of that, they really have success. They keep moving up the levels, and I think sort of bring to the party what you have, so to speak.
Right.
I guess,
No, that's great advice. That's great advice. Just, from my own curiosity and for others, because I know players get so wrapped up in their stat line, so wrapped up in it. And I've even had conversations with Luke Shen, like, so the guy that was with in Kelowna, and his draft year, he was just so rattled that he wasn't getting points, right? And the coaching staff was trying to tell him, well, no one's drafting you to be running their power play. Like no one sees that in you, right? So you just need to relax about that.
And that's exactly what he does today in the NHL. He just moves pucks and defends.
Right. There's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with that.
Not a bit.
Yeah. So do you draft, like when you're doing the Bantam draft, generally the glory positions, like the first rounders, are these guys that are, that are flashy, that are scoring the highlight reel goals, and you think are going to be a top point guy for you. At certain points, are you drafting like a guy that you see being a Luke Shen, a good, solid stay-at-home defender that's going to move pucks and isn't going to have a stat line that blows you out of the water?
No, I think those things all come into your evaluation and your discussion when you're ranking players, So, I look at our roster in Calgary right now. We've got guys that are that kind of a player. We got another guy that's got really good hands, sees the games, moves the puck. So our expectation for him is, he's going to put up some points, But again, I go to events, and the one thing I do though, I chart goals and assists, because in the end, some guy hasn't done much out there, but what has he done? God, he's got three points. Why did he do that? And then you start to look at it. He just does this all the time. Well, you need that player on your team, even though his compete level isn't where it should be, or his skating isn't what it should be, And it's the same with a defenseman that just moves pucks and defends. So he's got 2 goals and 10 assists over 68 games. That's not a lot of points, but boy, oh boy, he plays 25 to 30 minutes a night. Why? Because he moves pucks and defends. I need those players.
No, that's good. That's all I wanted to hear, because I think that's.
And again, so I think what it is, Jason, is where they go in the draft might be that a guy that's going to defend and moves pucks might not be that elite guy in the first or second round. He might slide. And I say he might slide from 1 to 2, or he might slide from late first round to early second, something like that, because of the perception that, okay, he's going to be a stay-at-home shutdown guy. Well, that guy over there is going to get 70 points for somebody. So, I mean, that's hard to find, so that's, but again, every organization values those things a little differently too. So, I got to be careful how I come off on that, because, again, I look at the Kelowna Rockets for years. They just seem to keep producing defensemen. And obviously, their group of scouts there have zeroed in on things that they think are important, and it's been good for their team. And those guys have moved on to play at the pro ranks too.
Right. Yeah, no, valid point. I wanted that message to get out, and it's a drum that I've been beating for a long time. Is that, I have actually a client of mine. I won't mention his name, but I'm sure he wouldn't mind. But he playing in the school system, like the academy system, big body. Maybe what somebody you might say, Gary, has some heavy feet, but like, boy, try and take the puck off him down below the goal line, right? Good luck. Great shot, sees the game well, make plays. But he was getting lost on his team from his own identity of the dipsy doodlers, right? The guys that would come in and toe drag somebody and were maybe getting more points than him. And he was lost in trying to be a 5'8" water bug, and he was a Mack truck. And like what I've been talking about, it's okay to be a Mack truck, right? Like that's awesome, actually, right? Don't try and be a water bug. And since he's really embraced that mentality, yeah, he might not ever be a point a game guy, but he's going to be somebody that when you watch who he is and what he's most likely going to be, and that helps him, and it also helps you. So not everybody's going to be the top of the umbrella on the PP, right? And that's okay. Just be who you are, and that's going to allow you to move on a heck of a lot quicker with some more certainty, I think.
Right, and again, I come back to interviewing players, and I'll say, so what kind of a player are you? And defense will tell me I'm an offensive defenseman. I'll say, you had 2 goals and 10 assists last year. Like, that's not my definition of an offensive defenseman. But don't get me wrong, I really like the way you play, because you move the puck out of our end all night long and you defend very well. It just doesn't translate into offensive points. But you're an important member of our team, and I use that example, I guess, because I played that position, and somebody made a comment, "Oh, you must have been an offensive defenseman." I said, "There's no way I was. Just my stats." and Luke Chin, that's what we're talking about. There's a guy that he finally figured it out at some point. I don't need to worry about my points. That's not what's going to make the difference for me to get to the next levels.
Right.
Because that's not me. Yeah.
I love it. And that self-assessment, that ability to self-assess and that self-awareness, that's one thing that I totally talk with players about and try and work on. I believe it's a skill, right? And the quicker the better you get at it, right? You talked about strengths and weaknesses, like all those things as a player that go into this package you're talking about. I used the word empowerment earlier. Like the more empowered you are, the better, the way you can increase your self-assessment skills. So you can fine tune these things, right? And you can expand on your strengths, and you can undercut your weaknesses. So there's nothing glaring there. Like these are all the little details that I think the detailed players get, and the detailed players then have a competitive advantage. And that's what I'm trying to give these guys when I'm working with them. So thanks for your time, Gary. Boy, I know we could sit here probably all day, and I told you 60 minutes, and here we are at almost an hour and a half. So we'll cut her short, but a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of experience, and I know there's tons of lessons in the program today. So thanks so much for being here. I'm very grateful.
Well, my pleasure, and I guess I'll see you as a parent quite a bit here in the next 12 or 14 months, will I?
Well, you know what? You got one of 3 coming your way. So yeah, you might be seeing a lot of me for the next 4 years here. So,
well, I look forward to crossing paths with you, Jason, in the arenas, because I'll be at the arena, I can assure you.
Awesome. Well, I'll see you there, Gary. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for sticking around to the end. I really appreciate everybody for being here and enjoying the program. It's a very easy conversation to get lost in, I found personally, and I'm sure you did here too, if you're here till the end. Gary had so much insight. There's so many nuggets there, so many lessons. Some of my takeaways were his head, hands, feet, and heart. I thought that was a really succinct way of looking at it. The line from his wife that a sailor doesn't become a great sailor in calm seas. How true is that? And really speaks to what it is that I do with the Peak Potential Hockey Project and with helping players be ready for that adversity before it comes, and also being able to navigate it when it is there. That is definitely something that I love working with athletes on. And just his insight on the Junior A versus WHL, how far the WHL has come with player support and with the focus on education, and the opportunity to play with the best players. His insights on the WHL draft, and also just the message to the players, right? The message to the players about player identity, about not putting all your eggs in the draft basket. That it is their job to go find you as a player. So parents, the message there is also you do not have to remortgage your house to make sure that your player is in the absolute best league that's going to cost me $35,000 for the season. That is not necessary. What is necessary is a passion for the game. What is necessary is a direct, deliberate attention to development for your player, and dominate the level that you're at. Be who you are and be the best that you can be at the level you are at, and continue to do that year after year, and you will be found. You will be found, I promise you. Good players have a way of getting found. There is enough people out there at rinks trying to find players. There's enough people out at rinks trying to give good players, be the person that is noted for providing good players, to making an awareness there. So there is ways to be found, I promise you. And if you don't get drafted at 14 or 15 years old, that is not the end of the road. It is still only the beginning, even for the first rounders, as Garry once said there. That he's had first rounders that haven't worked out. That's the way it goes. He had, as he mentioned in there, he had Kelowna has an 8th rounder that is now making their team as a 16-year-old. That is fantastic stuff. Not to mention his line about Carter Hart being an 8th round pick in the WHL draft, who is now a starting goaltender in the NHL. You never know where you start, and you never know where the end is going to be. But I can promise you, if you play hard, keep your head up, and learn the mindset intangibles along the way. If you're willing to get support, you're willing to be coached, and you have a big heart with some passion, things are going to work out. As Brad Larson said in a previous interview, if you do everything you can do, you can walk away with your head high. Nobody wants to have excuses to look back on and say, oh, I wish I would have done this, or I wish I would have done that. Just go all in. Go all in on your physical development. Go all in on your mental development and your personal development. Play hard. Be a good teammate. Do the right things, and things will work out. It doesn't have to come down to dollars and cents or exactly what team you're on. So thanks very much for staying here. Garry, again, if you're listening, really appreciate the conversation. I look forward to more in the future and to bumping into you at a rink sometime soon. And as we were joking about, I'm assuming that a Podolin, a younger Podolin, a younger, better version Podolin will be on your scouting radar list here in a year or two. So we'll cross paths then for sure. But until then, everybody, play hard and keep your head up. Just watch